I'm James Miller. Welcome to Critical Thinking. In this course, we'll look at the history of philosophy and the development of reason. We'll look at the foundations set by the rationalists and the empiricists, and we'll study the relationship between faith and science. We'll talk about the work of the Holy Spirit and also develop some critical skeptical tools that will allow us to identify common fallacies. The goal, by the time we're done, is that we would be able to analyze big ideas critically and come up with some of our own. Glad you're with me. Let's get started. Anyone who wants to be a critical thinker today, or to be a teacher of critical thinkers, needs to engage with modern skepticism. We need to look at how one goes about asking critical questions of ideas and what happens when we get trapped in cycles of doubt that are ultimately unfeasible as we live our lives. To do that, I want to look at a history of cynicism. I want to go back and look at the ancient Hebrew book of Ecclesiastes, probably written 1000 BC, and talk about what the existential crisis of skepticism is. And then I want to talk about the ancient Greeks, and particularly the skeptic or the cynic Diogenes. We're then going to leap to the modern era, and I don't mean contemporary modern, I mean philosophically modern era. And we're going to look at the doubts initiated by René Descartes and then deepened by David Hume. And then I want to look at skepticism in our modern day, actually in contemporary culture. Good critical thinkers need to use skepticism as a tool to target things that merit doubt and criticism. But getting lost in a skeptical worldview is ultimately untenable. You can't live as a complete skeptic, a global skeptic. Skepticism only works as a tool, but by and large, day to day, we make all kinds of assumptions and take all kinds of things on faith. Let's see if we can sort out what things we can and should believe and what kinds of things we need to cast doubt upon. Let's start by looking at the ancient Hebrew book of Ecclesiastes. The book begins by saying that it is written by a son of King David and a wise teacher. So historically, many people have attributed this to King Solomon. Some people have said that perhaps this was written by Hezekiah or edited under Hezekiah. And some critical scholars believe that this was actually written during a Hellenistic period, much later, although there is very little evidence by which to date this outside of the text itself. The book of Ecclesiastes is a book that makes many people wonder why it's in the Bible at all. It's a very skeptical and cynical book. The author seems to have given up on a lot of life. It says over and over again that life is meaningless and there's nothing new under the sun. The author, the teacher, the purveyor of wisdom, claims to set out to explore life and explores pleasure and explores knowledge and explores hard work and finds over and over again that everything leads to nothing. The word for meaningless here, the word translated meaningless, is the Hebrew word hevel, and it actually means a fog. It actually means a lack of clarity. When it says that life is meaningless, it doesn't mean that life has no meaning at all. It just means that its meaning is often veiled. When we pursue pleasure, we find often that pleasure leaves us empty and unsatisfied, Ecclesiastes says. When we pursue power or money, we often find that we commit ourselves to a lot of hard work and then have to pass on what we have earned to the person who comes next after us. And the author of Ecclesiastes says, "Who knows whether that person will be wise or a fool? I do all this hard work, I make all this money, and then I have to leave it to someone else. This too is meaningless and a chasing after the wind," the author says. We can pursue wisdom, and the author seems to find value in wisdom, although the author concludes that the wise don't often win in life. The race does not go to the fastest. And so even if we pursue wisdom and gain wisdom, wisdom has its own personal satisfaction that comes with it, but it does not guarantee us a better life. So the book of Ecclesiastes captures a sense of existential doubt and failure. A very early work alluding to the fact that people can strive for all kinds of things in life and end up feeling like it was not worth anything at all. Well, there are a few things that Ecclesiastes actually does affirm, a few things that it says actually are worthwhile. First of all, it says it's worthwhile to honor God, to do what's right in God's eyes. The book says that the people who do what's right don't always win in the end. But the author of Ecclesiastes seems to hold up the idea that it's essential to do what's right anyway. Even if it doesn't benefit us materially, we should do what's right. Secondly, the book of Ecclesiastes focuses on thriving in the present moment. Over and over again, it says there's very little of value other than finding satisfaction in your daily work and in your eating and drinking and being merry. Ultimately, everything will end in death for both the successful hard worker, for the lazy person, and for the cheat. Everything ends up in death anyway. So the best thing you can do is to savor the present moment, to live for today, and not try to compare yourself to others or try to amass wealth for yourself, because all of that is futile. Thirdly, the author says or implies that humility is of value, that having the sense to look at life and realize a lot of it won't go the way you want, that a lot of the things you work hard at won't benefit you, that worldview, that humble worldview of realizing a lot of it is futile, is actually a healthy way to live. And that's where Ecclesiastes wants to leave us. It commiserates with us in our worst days, in our depression and in our sufferings. It shares with us that sense of anger and frustration that life isn't fair. But then it leaves us with hope. God is still there, and God is good. And so living for today, to do well today, is of value. It's the best we have. And then having the humility to realize that in the end, it's all going into the ground. It's the best, those are the best realizations to have and the best way to live. So that's an early taste from the ancient world of a hint of skepticism that will later be refined and defined by the philosophers. As we peruse the history of skepticism, we can't skip over Diogenes, the ancient Greek cynic philosopher, who lived from around 400 BC to around 320 BC. Diogenes grew up the son of a banker, someone who minted coins, and at one point was said to have defaced a number of the coins, stamping them with an awl, leaving them without value. And at that point he was exiled from his hometown and rejected by his father. He did this because he believed that the life that many Greeks were living was a waste of time, that the Greeks had committed themselves to habit and custom and culture without thought. And as a philosopher, he wanted to bring doubt onto the normal ways of doing things. He did this by living a radical life. He chose to abandon the normal course of pursuing career and wealth and comfort, and instead lived in the street. He lived as a homeless man. Year-round, he had nothing but a cloak and a staff and a bag, and had no personal possessions beyond those. Furthermore, he ridiculed the Greeks of his day, making fun of them for living their lives. He'd sit out in the street and laugh at them for going about their business, because he said they were wasting their lives occupied by things that were meaningless. He formed a school of thought, or was the inspiration for a school of thought that's known as cynicism. Cynicism is a word that comes from the ancient Greek kunikos, which is the Greek root for canine, or Greek root for dog-like. The Latin canine comes from canis, which probably has the same linguistic root originally. So Diogenes was said to be a dog-like philosopher because he lived in the street and just ran around making himself happy. When he wanted to eat, he ate and didn't care what anyone thought of him. He lived generally in what's sometimes called a bathtub or a wine jar. He just slept out in the street in this tub that he had found. There are instances of Diogenes doing things that were wholly offensive. He would urinate in public, and once apparently jumped up on stage at a theater, gave a speech, and then defecated. There's a legend that he was once confronted by Alexander the great general and leader of Greece. And when Alexander the Great stopped and stared down at Diogenes lying in his tub, He asked the then fairly well-known philosopher if there was anything he could do for him. And Diogenes says, yes, get out of my sunlight. Another version of that story says that Alexander replied, if I were not Alexander, I wish I were Diogenes. And Diogenes replied, if I were not Diogenes, I would wish I was Diogenes too. So in other words, Diogenes tried to impress upon the Greeks, ultimately satisfaction was to be found very much in the living of the day, just for happiness, without any concern for appearances, longevity, or creature comforts. In this way, there's some very clear similarities to the author of Ecclesiastes, who said, you should just live for the pleasure of the day. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. Diogenes introduced into philosophy a certain level of scorn of the normal, and that's going to be the foundation of skepticism, a criticism of things that people take for granted. A couple of stories that are circulated about Diogenes are these. It's said that at one point he had carried around a little wooden bowl from which he would collect water to drink it. And then one day he saw a poor boy drinking from cupped hands. And so he smashed his bowl and destroyed it, saying, I can't believe I've wasted my time carrying around something unnecessary. Another story is about Diogenes carrying around a lamp during the day. He'd walk around in bright sunlight carrying a lamp. And when people asked him what he was doing, he would say, I'm looking for a man. In other words, no one qualified for the job. No one was quite a man. No one was living with the intentionality that a man should. Diogenes eventually was captured by pirates and taken into slavery and settled in Corinth in Greece. As he did so, he came to influence other philosophers who would be the founders of Stoicism. And Stoicism is a movement that's existed in philosophy and is enjoying a renaissance again today. This was Diogenes, and his life has influenced the lives of many who have come after. There are similarities that can be drawn between the life of Diogenes and the life of Socrates. But likewise, we can look at the particular influence that Diogenes had on people like perhaps St. Francis, although it's hard to draw a direct connection because Francis claims to take all of his influence directly from Jesus. However, there are similarities between the two in terms of their abandonment of wealth and social status. If you look at the life of Henry David Thoreau and his writing Walden, when he moved out to the woods to live a minimalist life, you can see similarities there. And certainly Thoreau knew of Diogenes and was somehow influenced by Diogenes' work. Diogenes' philosophy has shaped a good deal of the history of skepticism. And so we will continue to pursue that into the Enlightenment. The father of Enlightenment philosophy is René Descartes. René Descartes was a French philosopher who began to ask questions about how things can be known and what can be known with certainty. He emerged in an era of history in which the European Protestants and Catholics were fighting each other, sometimes in bloody wars like the 30 Years' War. And philosophers began to look around for groundings for truth and political governance that were somehow separated from, or at least free from, the dogmatism of the Catholic Church and of religion generally. Descartes began to ask questions about how one could ground knowledge in reason alone. The legend goes that for his Meditations in First Philosophy, his famous book, that he climbed into an oven and closed the door behind him so that he could doubt all of his senses, so that essentially he could see nothing and hear nothing and separate himself off from the world. He said that even in that darkness, nonetheless, he was still aware of his thoughts. And so somehow his thoughts had more certainty than his empirical senses. He then began to ask questions about his thoughts themselves and said, well, I might be dreaming and just not be aware of it. Or I could be tempted by an evil demon who is somehow deceiving me into thinking that I'm here in this room when in fact I'm not. I can't guarantee the certitude of any of my rational thoughts alone, except for one. I can't doubt that I'm doubting, because if I doubt that I'm doubting, I'm still doubting. And so doubting goes on. Without question, when I'm doubting, that's what's happening. There's nothing more basic than that. And that led Descartes to his famous maxim, I think, therefore I am. Thinking is at the foundation of all things. Now, he does make an assumption that many philosophers have pointed out, that there's an I that's doing the thinking, when in fact all that he had asserted confidently was that thinking occurs, not that there's clearly an I that's doing it or what that I is. But nonetheless, he assumes the statement, I think, therefore I am, is a safe one. And from there, he goes on to build an argument for the existence of God, which no one finds persuasive today. But it comes from the idea that because I have this clear and distinct idea of God in my mind, God must be there. I can't have dreamed that up. He then goes on to argue from there to say God is justifying and preserving my perceptions of the outside world that must somehow be correct. All of this is considered very shaky by philosophical standards, but it was a radical turn for its day, pointing philosophy in the direction of grounding the governance of society and knowledge itself on reason, not even on empirical senses, and certainly not on the church or the Bible. This began what we now call modern philosophy. And those seeds of doubt undergird all of philosophy. So as philosophers wrote in the season after Descartes, they often begin from a perspective of skepticism about what previous philosophers have written. I remember talking to one PhD student in a university who said that the ultimate goal of being a PhD student is to criticize one of the great minds in history. That there's this small room that contains all the greatest minds, and if you can push one of them out of that room, then you get to be in the room as one of the great minds of history. And all philosophical work, all academic work now is trying to criticize or chastise something important that's come before you so that you can rise to importance yourself. Whether or not that's true, I don't know, but it does say that skepticism has become a fundamental part of how the academic building process works. PhD students are taught to think critically about the ideas that have come before them, to challenge them, to tear them down, and to try to make a claim of their own. That perhaps can all trace its way back to René Descartes. Certainly we talk about the Enlightenment, the philosophical Enlightenment, as beginning with him. Afterwards we look at philosophies like John Locke and George Berkeley and David Hume and Immanuel Kant as Enlightenment philosophers who built upon Descartes' work and stood upon his shoulders. Now we come to one of the world's great skeptics, again in the age of reason, the Scottish philosopher David Hume. David Hume was born in the city of Edinburgh, a beautiful city with a castle in the middle of it, from which I earned a master's degree. And he was trained by his father to pursue law, though he found law to be fairly boring and decided that's not what he would do. He then went into the academic world and attempted to get jobs both at the University of Edinburgh and one of the other Northern European universities, but failed to attain either position. And so he decided he would be a writer and write philosophical works for a public audience. So he wrote one of his now famous works called The Treatise on Human Nature. The problem was it's sort of a long, boring slog in terms of popular literature, and no one bought it. Hume's word on it was that it fell stillborn from the press. It essentially died before it was born, and no one read it. So he then adapted his writing style and began to write in more common language for a more popular audience, and became very well known, writing collections of essays and writing books on history. And I believe he wrote a book on sailing or on ships, and became very rich by doing that. And at one point said, when he was asked to do something, he said, "I'm now too rich and too fat to care." Made light of the fact that he became comfortable and well off, opulent. So that was Hume's basic biography. He'd die in 1776 in Edinburgh, and died very calmly and happily, having spent a lot of his life building good relationships with people. Now, philosophically, Hume is an empiricist, so he falls in line with John Locke. He believes that knowledge comes to the mind through the five senses and then is assembled within the mind into more complex ideas. But all information, all knowledge that we have comes originally through the senses. Hume's great contribution is to begin to doubt what the mind does with knowledge when it combines it. And he says there are some ideas in the mind for which we have no grounding. Our minds have taken in sense data and combined them into ideas that are actually false. And this is why Hume is considered a great skeptic. A couple of the big philosophical ideas on which he would cast doubt is, first of all, on the idea of identity. He's famous for this. When you study identity as a concept, as a philosophical concept, you have to study Hume. And Hume would say we have in our minds this collection of sense data. I see a table, I see sunlight, I see the blue sky, I see millions of impressions of data that I take in every day and I've taken in over a lifetime. And I assume there's a me that holds them, that there's a me, a personal identity that I have that contains all these ideas. But he says that's false. He says your identity morphs and changes over the course of time, and ultimately there's nothing that makes the me of 10 years ago connected to the me of today. We are simply a bundle of sense impressions that have been held together over time. Now, other philosophers have asked, what's the string that holds the bundle of ideas together, right? This is the same problem that Descartes ran into when he said, I think, therefore I am. And other philosophers says, what's the I? How do you know there's an I? All you know is that thinking exists. And the same challenge goes to Hume. You say there's a bundle of sense impressions. What's the bundle? What holds them all together? But we all suspect that there is. We all have a sense of personal identity. Anyway, Hume would cast doubt on the idea of identity at all, which you might think, now that's absolutely irrelevant. Of course, I know that I'm me and I know someone else is them, and why do I care if you can philosophically doubt that? Well, philosophically, it's just interesting to realize that identity is not what the ancient Greeks thought it was. They thought that everything has an essence that is part of its form, part of what makes it what it is. And Hume, 1700 years later, would say there is no essence, there is no thing holding identity together. In a pragmatic context, that question, the question of identity, does come out in some legal situations, such as if a person commits a crime and is only found out 10 years or 20 years later, is that person liable for the crime, and if so, how? Let's say they've gotten amnesia and they've totally forgotten the crime. They have no recollection of it. Let's say all the people who knew them 20 years ago are now dead. They have completely different social circles. Let's say they've gone through a horrific car accident and physically they are not the same person, the same form they were before. At what point is their identity so compromised that they can say, I'm not the person who committed the crime? Well, this is what people do when they plead insanity. When they say, I was mentally so unwell back then, you can't hold the mentally well me today accountable for what I did back then. And I have seen legal situations like that where somebody commits murder and literally cannot remember it. And they pass lie detector tests showing that they can't remember it. And at that point, usually, even if they're found guilty, they're given a lighter sentence than someone who intentionally and consciously committed a crime and remembers it. So that's the subject of identity on which Hume leveled an entirely new kind of doubt. Secondly, another issue upon which Hume cast doubt, as never had been cast before, was on the subject of causality, on the subject of cause and effect. And Hume's illustration famously is billiard balls when we go to play pool. And you use a cue and you hit one ball, you hit the white ball into the black ball, and it goes in the pocket. And in your mind you think the white ball caused the black ball to go in the pocket. Hume says that idea of one thing causing another doesn't actually exist as a concept prior to experience. There is no cause and effect outside of our constantly experiencing cause and effect. And ultimately, we could find out that one day we hit the white ball into the black ball and the black ball doesn't move because somehow that experience of cause and effect is simply something that's been repeated over and over again. It's not something that's necessary. It doesn't actually exist. It's just that we've experienced this string of events over time. Modern physicists will talk about this in terms of the laws of nature and say that laws of nature aren't really laws. They're just customs. We see nature behave the same way over and over and over again, and we call it a law, but in fact it's not a law. And quantum physics will bring into question certain things that we've thought to be laws, such as the behavior of light and the location of electrons and things like that. Things that we have taken for granted as laws may not be quite so firm at their foundations. So Hume brought into doubt the idea that cause and effect existed as a category. This would have an immense influence on Immanuel Kant, who would say that Hume awakened Kant from his dogmatic slumber and made him consider these questions in new ways. And Kant would say that our mind actually categorizes knowledge as it takes it in. And one of the categories that our minds create is the category of cause and effect. But that's all to say, Hume brought skeptical questions to things that always before had been taken for granted. Another area in which Hume cast his skeptical vision was towards the area of religion. And Hume largely thought that religion was superstitious. He seems to have been maybe an agnostic who granted the possibility that there might be a God. And we're not sure now whether or not he did that simply because claiming to be an atheist would have gotten him ostracized from Scottish society, or if he really held open the possibility that there was a God. But nonetheless, when it comes to things like miracles, he would say that miracles cannot be believed in. He would say that the vast weight of evidence suggests that there's never going to be enough evidence to believe in a miracle. So for instance, and this reveals Hume's Western bias, he would say, we have very few instances of miracles, and where we do have them, they're far back in history. So we have only second and third hand reports of them. We don't have any first-hand experience of them. And because the laws of nature prove themselves true every day, we couldn't believe a story of a violation of the laws of nature, like a miracle, without a vast amount of evidence supporting it. And since there never will be a vast amount of evidence supporting it, we have to assume that on the basis of probability, miracles never happened. Even if we have a first-person experience of a miracle, even if we witness a miraculous healing or experience a miraculous healing, we would have to assume, based on the vast weight of evidence, that we were somehow deceived, that we got it wrong. Because there's so many instances of miracles never happening that if we actually saw one happen, we should assume that it didn't. Now that's a bit of a stretch to say your first-person experience must be wrong even though you experience it the way you do. Most people have trouble following that realistically, and well, they should, because Hume's argument is a bad one. Prior to 1698, I want to say, 1697, in Europe, they had never seen a black swan. And so it was entirely plausible to say all swans are white. The first black swan was discovered, I believe it was in Australia, the next year in 1697, somewhere in there. And after that, Europeans could no longer say there are no black swans. All swans are white, because in fact, one had finally been found. Now, the preponderance of evidence would still say all swans are white. If you found one out of all the swans out there that are black, you'd have to say, well, perhaps I'm deceived. Perhaps I'm having a hallucination, because I know over the course of history, all swans that have been experienced, all swans that have been seen have been white. All of my friends would say swans are white. So if I see a black swan, I have to deny it. But in fact, we now know that there are black swans, and that if you find one after years and years of never seeing one, the evidence should actually change your mind. And because of that, Hume's skepticism is now seen to be a little bit questionable, because his arguments from probability are not all that good. That's Hume's take on religion and on miracles. What this left Hume with ultimately was a kind of humility that was very helpful, very healthy. He left us with the idea that we should tolerate other religious viewpoints and treat other people with respect because we should have a certain level of doubt about our own convictions and belief. And so it's generally reported that Hume lived a gracious life at peace with his friends and eating a little bit too much and being happy, and that's how Hume lived and died. He certainly contributed heartily to the history of skepticism and to skeptical worldviews. And so anytime we study skepticism, Hume's name always comes up. Now we need to distinguish between two different kinds of skepticism and talk about why one of them is helpful and one of them is not. The first one is called global skepticism. And global skepticism is where we doubt the reality of everything. Here we can go back to the meditations of Rene Descartes, who wondered about whether or not he might be dreaming or there might be an evil demon deceiving him and putting all the impressions of the outside world into his brain, though in fact the outside world is very different or is not there at all. That's a kind of global skepticism. It's a way of doubting everything. A modern version of this that comes up in cognitive science is the idea of a brain in a vat, that somehow my brain has been removed from my body and placed in a vat of chemicals, is being kept alive by a scientist, and is being fed images of the outside world like in the Matrix. And somehow I am perceiving everything that's going on around me. I think I'm talking in my computer camera, but in fact I'm not. I'm a brain in a vat somewhere. That's global skepticism. And global skepticism is interesting as a thought experiment, but it doesn't do much in terms of changing the way we pragmatically live our lives. A different kind of skepticism is called targeted skepticism. And that's where we apply doubt to a certain issue. Like when we watch a magician do tricks and we think now that he can't actually be making the girl float in the air. The card didn't really disappear, it's somewhere. How can I cast doubt specifically on this issue or this question so as to raise doubts where doubts need to be raised? And that is called targeted skepticism. And targeted skepticism is very useful. It's the way critical thinkers analyze new ideas so as to find out what their weaknesses might be or when there might be deceptions or conspiracies. Targeted skepticism is a very helpful approach to life. The reason why we need to distinguish between the two is because global skepticism actually is not a skepticism in which a person can live. It ultimately leads to a complete hypocrisy. On a day-to-day basis, we make all kinds of assumptions based on faith. For instance, there's an old philosophical problem called the problem of other minds, which simply is the fact that I can't prove with any degree of certainty that any other mind exists. I can't prove that you exist, or that your mind works the same way mine does, or that you're not just some zombie who appears to have a mind, but in fact you're just walking around with no mind inside of you. The problem of other minds gives rise to the fact, gives us the awareness of the fact that the global skepticism leaves us with some really impractical conclusions about the world, or the belief that certain things can't be solved or dealt with, that in fact we deal with on a daily basis always. I always assume that people have minds and that I can interact with their minds and that interaction is important. I can never just assume that other minds don't exist. So it's important for us as critical thinkers and educators to remember skepticism as a targeted device, a tool that's used to point like a flashlight at a certain issue, is very helpful and useful. Global skepticism is sort of an interesting thought experiment, but it doesn't ultimately do anything for us because no one can live permanently in the world of global skepticism. Now, in response to skepticism, different philosophers have tried to solve the problem in different ways. Descartes tried to solve the problem of skepticism by referring to God. If I have a definite belief that there's a perfect being out there and that my mind cannot have created this idea of a perfect being, then that perfect being must exist. And if that perfect being exists, then the perfect being can guarantee the certainty of my other thoughts and impressions. Therefore, all my ideas last. That's one way to approach dealing with skepticism, although most people are not convinced by Descartes' theology. Another approach to it is the approach of Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell would say that in general, we have to argue to the most likely conclusion. We have to use a process of abduction to discern what is the most likely explanation for anything, much less the world around us. And to argue that we're in some kind of brain in a vat, or that some evil demon is deceiving us, or that we're dreaming, is not the most simple explanation for the world as we perceive it. The most simple explanation is that the world is pretty much the way we perceive it to be. And unless it's impressed upon us that we have to come up with an alternative explanation for that, we have no reason to. We have no reason to doubt common sense. The probability lies in the favor of common sense being correct, so let's just stick with that. A third response to skepticism comes from a philosopher named Hilary Putnam. And Hilary Putnam observes that our language requires a background of information that has to be true in order for language to work. And language fundamentally comes to us through an experience of the external world. Our ideas are implanted within us not simply by rational reflection, but by interaction with the world. And then we build linguistic explanations for the world based on our interactions with the world. So fundamentally, the idea that the philosopher creates when they propose a situation of global skepticism requires a linguistic foundation that can only have arisen from an interaction with the outside world. If the outside world didn't exist, then I wouldn't have the words necessary to propose a situation like the brain in a vat. So therefore, skepticism itself is hypocritical. It's self-contradictory. You couldn't have proposed skepticism if skepticism was actually the case. And so Putnam would say, we have therefore reason to believe in the external world because we can describe these skeptical scenarios in which there's not an external world. David Chalmers, a philosopher in Australia who's done a lot of reflecting on cognitive science, likes to say that no matter whether the global skeptical view is real or not, we have to learn to function within what seems to be common sense experience. So even if I am in the matrix right now, and none of what I perceive is actually reality, I have to function as though it is reality, so I might as well assume it is and deal with the concepts that come to me within the matrix. So even if I was in the matrix, it wouldn't matter. It doesn't change the way I think within the matrix, so just deal with it, Chalmers would say. Ultimately, nobody believes that a global skepticism is lasting or consistent. Skepticism is an excellent tool when used in a targeted way, but no one lives in a permanently skeptical worldview. Now, here's why that's important. We have to be conscious of the fact that when people raise doubts, especially doubts about religion, they are functionally using skepticism in a targeted way. And if we can show that they are using skepticism in a targeted way on religion, in which they've applied an unusual degree of scrutiny, then we have the right to raise questions about whether or not they are being consistent in their use of skepticism. So in other words, I've heard people raise doubts about miracles because they'll say, I've never seen one. Well, we've never seen any of the events of history that happened before we were born. All of history is passed on to us by word of mouth from someone else. All of our knowledge of the external world outside of our own first-person experiences comes from someone else. Our whole educational model of listening to lectures from teachers comes from the idea that I can learn things accurately from other minds. And if that's true, I have no right to arbitrarily say, but in the case of miracles, I have to experience it myself because that's the only way knowledge can come to me. We've already acknowledged that we receive knowledge through other people. You can't make an exception in the case of miracles unless there's a valid philosophical reason for saying this is an exceptional case. And in fact, it's not. Just as all of history has come to me through other people's writings and teachings, in the same way, I can hear stories and reports of miracles, and they are every bit as credible as any other report that has come to me. And I can apply the same level of skepticism to those things as I would to anything else, but I cannot rule them out. I cannot rule miracles out simply because they have not happened to me. Similarly, people will say on the subject of miracles, miracles can't happen because no one I know has experienced a miracle. Sometimes they will mistakenly say because most people have not experienced miracles. But in fact, if you look at the history of humanity, every culture in every era has held on to religious beliefs. We are a religious species. There's never been an exception to that. You can travel through modern day China, in which the communist government is explicitly atheistic, and you will find religious beliefs of all sorts. Not only Christians who are converting to, not only Chinese people who are converting to Christianity, but also Chinese people who worship ancestors or house gods. And that kind of religiosity exists even in countries that have attempted to enforce atheism on its people. Likewise, in modern Europe, which considers itself skeptical and atheistic and post-Christian, as you travel across Europe, you find there are all kinds of religious ideas and beliefs, and a widespread, a rapid spread of Islam within European communities. Because in the vacuum of explicit religions, Islam is taking on new ground because it offers an explanation for people's intuitions that there really is a God out there. We, at our core, are a religious species. And so to claim nobody that I know has ever seen a miracle is simply short-sightedness. It's myopia, and it's absurd. Throughout history, people have claimed experiences of the supernatural, and we can't simply dust them away because the 10 people that we spend our time with are dusting them away as well. I've actually started asking people in casual conversation a question that has turned out to be very fruitful. After I talk to people for a while and get to know them, and they know that I'm a religious person, and know that I'm kind of a non-threatening religious person, I'll get around to asking them in one way or another. I'll say, have you ever seen anything that you thought in one way or another was supernatural? Have you seen a ghost? Or have you experienced things that were paranormal in some way? Or you ever have a prophetic experience where you knew something that you just couldn't know naturally? And I would say 1 out of every 2 people that I talk to say yes. I remember talking to a guy one time in a cafe, and I don't remember him being particularly religious, but I asked him, have you ever had any experiences of the supernatural? And he said no. And I said, oh, okay, so yeah, about 1 out of every 2 people don't, and so you're one of those who don't. And then we talked for a while and talked for a while and talked for a while, and it came back around and he said, oh yeah, well, I forgot there was this one thing that happened. He said, I remember one time lying in bed at night, and I saw this dark form walking across my room, and I pulled my covers up over my head, and when I looked again, it was gone. And he didn't say I was dreaming or I thought I might have imagined it. He said, I saw a dark shape walking across my room. Now, we can rationalize it away. Maybe he didn't see it. Maybe he was asleep, any number of different things. But almost 1 out of every 2 people I talk to have some experience like that. There have been 4 different situations in my life where I've received a call from someone who said there are strange things happening in my house and I don't know what to do about it. And in 3 of the cases, the people that I talked to were either not religious at all or were only vaguely religious. I mean, not in any way zealously religious. And part of the reason they called me is because they didn't know what else to do. In one of the cases, the family did have some religious background, although they had been into some strange things as well. I'll tell you one of the situations and you can assess it yourself. I got a call from a family and they were sort of involved in our church, not deeply so. And so I didn't know if they were particularly committed to the Christian faith. We hadn't really talked about it, but the mom called me one day, the wife called me one day and said, Pastor Jim, I don't know how to tell you this, but strange things have been happening in my house. And I said, like what? And she goes, well, like the other day, my kids were playing in the living room and the TV started turning on and off. And I said, call an electrician. You know, I always go for the natural explanation first. And she said, yeah, I was going to do that. But then she gets quiet. And I said, hello, are you there? And she said, oh, sorry. She said, yeah, I was going to do that. But then something else happened. I was downstairs cooking and I don't want to say she had like a 3 or 4 year old daughter, like a little girl. My little girl was upstairs and she began screaming. And I was cooking, so I said, honey, I can't come upstairs right now. I'm cooking, can you come down here? And she said, my daughter came running downstairs into the kitchen and she said, Mommy, the shadows are walking around in the hallway. And I said, yeah, kids have a good imagination. It could be a natural explanation. And she said, yeah, I thought so too. And she got quiet. And I said, hello? Hello, are you there? And she said, oh yeah, sorry. She said, yeah, but something weird happened in my neighborhood also. And I said, what's that? And she said there was a guy down the street who moved into a house, bought a house that was for sale, and a month later he put up a for sale sign and he was moving out. And I went down there to see what was going on, and I said, "You just moved in. Why are you moving out already?" And he said, "I live here alone, and every morning I get up and go to work, and I lock the door. All the windows are locked. There's nobody in the house." And when I get home, everything has been taken out of the cabinets and placed on top of the counters. And so I put it all away. I've searched the house up and down. There's nobody in the house. I lock the house. Everything's sealed up tight. And then I leave. And when I get home at the end of the day, everything has been taken out of the cabinets and put up on top of the counters. He says, it happens every day, and I'm leaving. And I said, oh, okay, well, yeah, I don't know what that is. And then she doesn't say anything back. And I said, hello, are you still there? And she said, yeah, I'm here. And I said, what's wrong? You keep getting quiet. Is there something wrong with our phone connection? And she said, no, but when I started talking to you, the radio right next to me started turning on and off. And I said, would you like me to come over to your house and pray for your house? And she goes, no, I'm going to the mall. And she went out to go shopping. And then later that day, my wife and I and a woman from our prayer team went over to her house and we prayed for her house. And I've done this 4 different times now for 4 different houses. Nothing happens. You pray, the lights do not turn on and off. There are no voices, there's no smoke, nothing happens. You pray for a few minutes, everything's very quiet, and you have a nice conversation and then you leave. And a couple weeks later, I'd check in with the family and say, anything else happen? And they would say, no, it's totally stopped. And I'd check in a few weeks later and say, is everything okay? And they say, yep, nothing came back again. And that is how that goes. Now, you can do with that what you like. But those were not religious families looking to have religious experiences. Those were families who didn't care very much about religion. And something came to them. So, by and large, we can take a skeptical view of the world, but to dismiss miracles saying, well, they never happened to me or happened to my friends, that just doesn't work. Most of humanity throughout history has a corporate experience of something beyond the material. And ultimately, even if we're skeptical people, we have to deal with that reality. Hume was wrong because the probability of it happening based on the number of reports that exist lean in the direction of the supernatural being real. All right, so we've talked about how our innate bias towards preserving ourselves threatens objectivity. We've talked about how at a deeper level, cognitive distortions, our psychology, threatens objectivity. And now I want to talk about how at the level of evolutionary science, our ability to perceive the world objectively is threatened in a philosophical way, but this draws from evolutionary psychology. Okay, so there's a quote in the writings of Charles Darwin about evolution and about what evolution must have done to our brains. And this question that Darwin raised has become known as Darwin's Doubt. You probably know something about Darwinism. His theory was that human life came about through a process of mutation and natural selection and adaptation. The idea is that at the genetic level within a species, something changes, something mutates, and that causes a change in the form, the morphology of the species. Like a bird's beak grows longer, or a fish develops legs, or something like that. But in tiny little changes, tiny little mutations over millions of years. And the environment then, which is generally hostile to life, the environment of the earth with all of its toxins and poisons and
lava and hurricanes and everything else, then actually weeds out the weaker forms of life, and the stronger forms, the stronger mutations, survive. This is called survival of the fittest. And over millions of years, that causes changes, adaptations in life, so that life presumably is getting better and better at surviving. And the goal of this whole process is survival. We adapt to survive. Not to get better, not to get more moral, not even necessarily to get smarter, if getting smarter doesn't contribute to our survival. It's all about surviving. And that is the process of Darwinian evolution. Darwin published The Origin of the Species in 1859. And when he did, it went off like a bomb in the Western universities. And in both the European and the American universities, scholars were reading Darwin's work and seeing this as an alternative explanation to where human life came from than the biblical account of God creating human beings with a purpose. Now, according to Darwinian evolution, which an atheist named Thomas Huxley took up early on and said that this is a great boon for atheists. Now, atheists have an explanation for life. Though there were Christian theologians who said we can accept evolution as a tool that God used, so long as we understand it not to be blind chance and arbitrary mutation, but rather something guided by the hand of God. But anyway, there was now a movement in Western academia to say we now have an intellectual foundation for atheism. We know where human life came from. And essentially, we're an accident. We were not designed. We don't have a purpose. There is no great overarching goal for humanity. We've just survived. And survival is just the thing that's happening. And that has shaped the history of the world ever since. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher right around 1900, was writing that God is dead and we've killed it. We've come up with alternative explanations for human life, and God is no longer necessary. We have human reason, we have an accounting of human life, and now we can do away with theology and morality because the best thing that human life can do is just express its own greatness, show what a brilliant genius Superman can be, and it doesn't matter what that person does as long as they take power and act it out in the world. And that philosophy would lead to its full expression in Nazi Germany in the 1940s. But all that to say, Darwin proposed this new theory, which is now known all over the world. There are still some circles that debate it, and not just Christian circles. There's a philosopher at New York University named Thomas Nagel, who's written a book called Mind and Cosmos, in which he really disputes whether or not evolution is sufficient to explain certain things. But all that to say, this is Darwin's theory. But in the midst of proposing this theory, Darwin had a problem with his own theory. Darwin had a doubt about it. And I want to read you the quote from Darwin about his doubt here. He asks if our brains have evolved simply to survive, why can we trust that our brains are being objective? Why can we trust that our brains are gathering the truth about the world around us? Because the goal of survival isn't truth. The goal of evolution isn't truth. The goal of evolution is survival. And you don't necessarily have to know the truth about the world in order to survive. Here's how Darwin put it. But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of a man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind? So in other words, if my thinking processes have simply come out of the thinking processes of a monkey, why are mine better or more reliable or more truthful? Could there be anything wrong with my thinking processes that somehow undermines the possibility of objectivity? Well, About 3 decades ago, a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, who's a professor at Notre Dame University, uh, and I believe he was a Yale grad. I believe he was an Ivy League Yale grad. Plantinga has written a number of powerful books in philosophy. Wrote really just a chapter of a book, but it became a paper in its own right. And it's called his Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. And this is how the argument goes in simplistic terms. The atheistic believer in evolution has in their minds the idea that the world is only, the universe is only natural. There are only natural things. There is no God. There are no angels. There are no miracles. There is no supernatural anything. There is only the physical universe, the natural world. That belief Plantinga calls naturalism. In the natural world, my brain has come to be through millions of years of mutations, survival of the fittest, adaptation, and an ongoing process that has led to this thing I carry around in my head today. But the thing I carry around in my head today is only designed to support survival. Not designed is the wrong word. It only exists to support survival. It has come about through a process of survival, and the only goal of life is to keep surviving. So much as life has any goal at all, it's to protect itself. It's to continue surviving. Not only that, life isn't doing it intentionally. It's actually the environment that's making the decisions, quote unquote. The environment is killing off that which can't survive. So that which survives has simply preserved against the environment, often without any intention of doing so. Mutations have allowed us to survive in a hostile environment without even us consciously pursuing survival. So the brain that carries around the idea of naturalism is shaped by processes of adaptation and survival of the fittest. At no point in that process is it absolutely necessary that my brain perceive things truthfully and objectively. In fact, it might be better if my brain got certain things wrong. There could be beneficial misperceptions that allow me to survive, that increase the likelihood of my survival, that improve my chances of surviving. And I'll give you an example. Let's say all of us are slightly more paranoid about the world than we need to be. Let's say all of us perceive the world as being a little bit more dangerous than it actually is. That might be a good adaptation. Because if I think the world is a little more dangerous than it actually is, I'm going to work a little bit harder to protect myself than I actually need to. And if I work a little bit harder to protect myself than I actually need to, I'm more likely to survive. So by misperceiving the world through things like a negativity bias, I'm actually going to be more likely to survive by getting things wrong. And so Plantinga then says, well, if that's the case, then the ideas in your mind have no guarantee to be truthful, including the idea of naturalism. The idea that you carry around in your mind of naturalism might be an adaptation for the sake of survival that's actually wrong. We might wrongly perceive that all there is the natural world around us. And so Plantinga's conclusion is you cannot cling to both evolution and an insistence that naturalism is true, because evolution undermines the possibility of objectively true perceptions of the world. That argument just created a furor, and there have been entire books of essays written rejecting that one essay. And great philosophers have chimed in on this and debated it left and right. Daniel Dennett and Alvin Plantinga published a book together debating that one question. And it's a fun read and a fascinating read. And it's neat when one little argument has such cogency and power that a wealth of literature is created around it. So that's Darwin's Doubt, and then Alvin Plantinga played out the doubt in a bigger scale, a broader scale. Um, C.S. Lewis actually picked up on this idea at one point and alludes to it I think in Mere Christianity, but Plantinga really plays it out. And now in modern science, there's actually a new exploration of this idea in a kind of argument called evolutionary debunking arguments, EDAs. And one of the most important articles on EDAs was written by a woman named Sharon Street in 2006, I think it was. And Street now carries the idea of evolutionary. Well, let me tell you what evolutionary debunking arguments are. Evolutionary debunking arguments are arguments that suggest if something came about through the process of evolution, it cannot be relied upon to be objectively true. So Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism is an evolutionary debunking argument. It is an argument that debunks something on the basis of the fact that it came about through evolution. So Sharon Street wrote an article about evolutionary debunking arguments and applies it to the realm of ethics, applies it to the realm of right and wrong, good and bad. And she says that there are certain people out there who want to believe that there is simply right and wrong in the world. We call these ethical realists. There are ethical facts about the world. It is simply wrong to torture a child. There is never a world in which that's going to be okay. It's just absolutely wrong. And even if everybody thought it was okay, it would still be wrong because it's an ethical fact that that is a wrong thing to do. Well, Street and others want to say that if our ethical thoughts came about through an evolutionary process, those ethical thoughts came about through a process which is intended for survival. It exists for the sake of causing life to survive. And if life exists only to survive, if it comes about only through a process of the environment weeding out non-productive adaptations, then the ethical ideas that we have in our minds cannot be relied upon to be objectively true either. The things that you think are right and wrong are only there in your brain because evolution has decided they should be there in your brain. And in ethics, which is very subjective, there are all kinds of reasons to believe that we might have some strong ethical feelings about what's right and wrong that actually are not based on anything objective at all. And at the end of the day, if our brains have become what they are through a process of blind chance and mutation and then adaptation, survival of the fittest, there's no reason to believe that the things that we feel most strongly are right and wrong should actually be declared right and wrong at all. Things like torturing a child or abuse or rape or murder or anything you want to say that we have these strong ethical feelings about. Evolutionary debunking arguments say, look, no matter what those ethical feelings are, they came about through a process which was not designed to reveal truth. The process exists to promote survival, and that's it. We have survived essentially by accident because adaptations have allowed us to, and nothing that we believe about the world, whether it be naturalism or moral realism or anything else, can actually be depended on to be objective. So that is a third case for rejecting objectivity. We have a bias towards preserving ourselves, personalization, and we all know that. I want to survive. I want to be happy. I want to be able to provide for myself. I'm not going to distribute all my wealth evenly through the world and then starve to death myself. Two, we have cognitive distortions. Our psychology gets things wrong. We perceive the world wrongly. And even when I know my brain's doing it, I can't stop it. I can't constantly in real time figure out where my brain's gone wrong and what the objective facts would be. And that's why we have so many arguments with each other. And thirdly, at a philosophical level in the natural sciences, in biology and evolution, there is no good reason to believe that my brain could achieve objectivity. Right? There's no good reason to believe that I could ever be objective. So I hope after listening to all that, if you began the lecture with a common sense perception that you just kind of know how the world is because you see it, you hear it, you smell it, you taste it, that our senses capture data about the world and write it on the blank slate in our minds, I hope you have now come to question that significantly. And this is what philosophers do. Philosophers undermine things that we take as common sense and make us reconsider the world. The next logical question to ask will be, so if everything that we believe is somehow wrong, how do we communicate at all? And this is a question that some deconstructionist philosophers asked in the 20th century. Can we know anything at all? Can we share information at all? And one of the great answers that you see historically came from philosophers like René Descartes. René Descartes, writing in the early 17th century, tried to shift human thinking from dependence on the church and the scriptures and authorities to human reason itself. And this is essentially the birth of the Enlightenment. The idea that human reason should be the grounding of all thought and the grounding of all politics. But in order to get there, Descartes first reduces all thought to doubt. He says, all I can know for sure is that I'm sitting here thinking. Because if I doubt that I'm thinking, that's still thinking. So thinking is still going on. And that's where he has his famous line, I think, therefore I am. I know my existence is real because I'm thinking. And thinking is the sure thing. But he immediately goes and he runs to God to build up any other knowledge. He says, once I know that I'm a thinking thing, the next thing I know is that I have a clear and distinct idea in my mind of this perfect being out there. And I wouldn't have an idea of a perfect being from anywhere else because there's no perfect being in the world. So the idea that I have this perfect being must be true. Now, I don't think this is a good argument, and most people do not think this is a good argument, but this was Descartes' argument. That one of the clear ideas I have in my mind is the idea of a perfect being of God. And because I know that God exists, that then guarantees that the rest of my knowledge of the world is actually true as well, is actually reliable as well. And so Descartes tries to salvage objectivity. He tries to rebuild objectivity by saying, well, there's a God that guarantees that my brain's working correctly. That argument just isn't going to work because our brains aren't working correctly, as modern science has shown. But the next question is going to be, so where can we go to find objectivity? What do we do? And that will get us even deeper into the subject of hermeneutics and how we interpret things, how we know objectively what an author intended when the author wrote things down, or if we can know it at all. But that will obviously be a subject for our next lecture.